the Russian stock market had its largest drop in nearly 3 years. Reuters is saying that it's because of failing peace talks, but those peace talks have been failing for a while. What's the real story? And is it a lot worse for Putin and the Kremlin regime? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Hit subscribe, and if you want to help us out, you can, of course, become a member over on combatvetnews.com. We just dropped some videos from the front lines, from some of the units that are actively shooting down Russian drones. It's some pretty wild stuff. So that's for members only. The link's in the description. Now, the Russian stock market dropped to a 3-year low. This is after the Kremlin made statements that U.S.-Moscow relations were, quote, collapsing. But this is sort of a strange story. So let me show you this. Here's the MOEX. This is the Moscow Exchange Index, and this is over the last 12 months. And you can see that it's actually lower than it's been any time in the last 12 months. It had a small little rally today, but yesterday dropping to just 2,500 rubles. And remember, the ruble is not exactly what it used to be. And you can see over the year to date, over the last 1 month alone, the market has lost nearly 10% of its value. This is not quite a crash, right? Generally, when you're talking about a bull market, you're looking at about a 20% pullback, and a crash of a market, like a true dyed-in-the-wool crash, is usually around 50%. But this is not good, right? If you invested in the Russian stock market 5 years ago, you're still down 7%. If you invested last year, you're down 5%. And if you invested in January, you're down nearly 9%. So this is a sign that, again, you can see that in February this year, right, there was real belief that the Trump administration would help sort of establish some kind of détente, some kind of reopening and peace with Russia, and give Russian industry a chance to return to international economic viability. But those hopes collapsed. And you can see the last time they rallied was, again, based on the Trump-Putin meeting, where there was hope that that there would be some kind of peace resolution. But since then, the market has been on a steady decline with basically no hope in sight. But again, I don't think that's the complete story. Yeah, the Kremlin's coming out and saying that there isn't really any momentum for peace. They said, quote, the Americans are to blame for the lack of peace talks. This is from the Russian Foreign Ministry. And now cracks have reached the foundation. Well, we could have told you that Vladimir Putin has no interest in peace. But here's where I think the story gets more complicated. And that is the statement by the Russian Central Bank. Now, the Russian Central Bank, remember, which is headed by Elvira Nabiullina, who is considered an excellent central banker, but more importantly, someone who was expressly forced to stay on in the role at the start of the war, despite her own desire to retire, essentially because Putin gave her no choice. He said, you are going to supervise the Russian economy going into this conflict. And Nabiullina has, well, the survival instincts that you need in Putin's regime, which is to do what dear leader says or else. So it's absolutely shocking for Russia's central bank to issue a direct criticism of the Kremlin. This, to me, is the real story. Russia's central bank has ruled that the state violated the rights of minority shareholders, those are like retail investors in these companies, when it seized these publicly traded Russian companies. Now, this is according to Reuters, but this is, again, as Reuters themselves says, this is the first explicit pushback by a Russian institution and the Russian elite on the nationalization process. So we've talked about the fact that a lot of Russian oligarchs are getting their companies seized, right? At the start of the war, a lot of American companies, as a result of the sanctions, cut their operations in Moscow, right? For example, McDonald's. And what happened is that the Russian government actually bought those businesses. And now they're not McDonald's, they're like, McVladimir's or whatever. But they're owned by the Russian state, and the profits from those companies in large part end up in Russian state coffers and help indirectly fund the war effort. But and we've seen that not just being Western countries, but in the last year or so, we've seen a number of prominent Russian business owners have their businesses seized for really on made up grounds, right? In one case, a Russian oligarch was convicted of being an extremist, whatever that means. And of course, conveniently, his multi-billion-dollar logistics and grocery store empire was seized by the Russian government. But the central bank is actually saying, hey, you can't do this, right? And the problem is that just because you're the billionaire owner, right? It's like Elon Musk is the owner of Tesla, but the owner of Tesla isn't just Elon Musk. It's actually all of us. We all own a little bit of Tesla if we own the S&P 500 index funds, and we all know a friend or family member who has a couple of shares of Tesla because they're just believers in the company. And those are the people who the Russian central bank says, listen, you screwed them. Because when the government seized all of those, McDonald's, or more importantly, when they seized all of those grocery stores, a bunch of minority shareholders who were not convicted of extremism or anything, they're just regular Russians, said, hey, you guys took my shares. And the fact is that we've talked about the fact on this channel that in the Russian government, the laws and the courts exist as the framework by which Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin oligarchs control the country. The courts do what Putin says they're going to do, right? Think of it. The law isn't like the law isn't supreme in Russia. The government doesn't have to abide by the law. The law is a tool by which the government exercises authorities. So if the government wants to take your company, it's going to do it. So the fact that the central bank itself is raising a red flag and, more importantly, explicitly and publicly saying, listen, the government can't just seize private property, right? Now, the complaint didn't actually question the legality of seizing property itself. The central bank ruled, again, that the state failed to make an obligatory buyout offer to shareholders in a public company and asked the state property agency to execute the offer. So essentially what they said is you can't just take 51% of a company. You can't just take the oligarch share and then say, good luck out there. All shares are canceled. This is now a state-run company. Instead, the state has to at least go to those other shareholders, other people who have the stock in their portfolio and say, listen, your company's going private. The state bought it, but here we go. We're going to give you the value of your shares, right? The problem is that by doing that, you may notice that the money goes in the direction Vladimir Putin doesn't want it to, which is away from the government. Right? Government needs money to fund its war effort. But we're seeing that more and more Russians, and more importantly, wealthy, well-connected Russians, are being punished by this, right? Listen to this. One source within Russia said, quote, the state's actions in the UGC case, this is one of the seized companies, are undermining the last semblance of private property rights in Russia, said one source with knowledge of the discussions who spoke on condition of anonymity due to the sensitive nature of the situation. So, again, this is the idea that if you own a house, it's yours. It's not the government's, right? You're not leasing it from the government. You have certain rights to that private property. And they're simply saying it doesn't. For example, another businessman, the source said that the state de facto devalued the stakes of private investors who purchase shares on the open market and have no connection to the court case against the company nor links to its owner, right? They said, quote, I take it when a nationalization of property is taking place, the law does not work. This is a private investor who held UGC shares. Again, this is someone who is just a regular Russian, a wealthy, well-connected one with investments, but no different than, again, your cousin who owns some Tesla shares. And as the problem is that the central bank actually has the interests of the Russian economy in their mind, right? Because the source said, quote, how can you convince anyone to buy shares after this? The long-term harm to the economy from actions far exceeds the benefits from whatever billions the government, are seizing, right? And a Russian lawyer confirmed to Reuters that there is a Russian law that says that publicly traded companies require, if any new holder, including the government, takes a 30% or more stake, you've got to make a buyout offer within 35 days of an ownership change with no exceptions. Now, to fund, of course, Russia's special military operation, its war of conquest in Ukraine, Russian authorities have seized about $50 billion of assets since the invasion, ranging from Western companies like a French food maker, but also from oligarchs convicted on of essentially made up crimes, right? And generally, these oligarchs, their conviction is that whatever they're convicted of is not the actual crime. The actual crime is running afoul of Vladimir Putin or failing to do his bidding. But you can see that this is a compounding problem because now the equity investments within the Moscow stock market are tanking, but also private businesses within Russia are also tanking, right? Russian metals industry facing layoffs, shortened work weeks, right? So you have both the average Russian worker having their economic viability get crushed. You have oligarchs and wealthy, well-connected Russians who are now also getting penalized, who say, listen, why would I buy a stake in a company if the government's going to come in and just yoink it whenever they want? And this is actually something I said about the Trump decision to annex 10% of Intel, right? Intel met with the government, and Intel simply said, we'll cough up 10% of our company. Well, Intel doesn't have 10% of its company to give away. It's going to have to get those shares from shareholders or dilute shareholders' value. And the issue is those shares came from someone, right? The Intel itself didn't own enough. So it had to either buy its own shares back. But the point is that the government stepped into the market and said, hey, you're going to cough up a stake in your company to us, the government, or else we're going to use all the tools of the government to punish you. And this is more egregious, the Russian policy of simply taking a company private and leaving existing shareholders to go get fucked. But the principle is exactly the same, which is if the government decides they own your company now, they're just going to do it. And if you are an individual shareholder in that company, go kick sand. The problem, as even this article points out, is that you end up with what's called the Russian discount, when that is the idea that Russian companies simply are valued lower than their Western European counterparts, even when you control for things like size and market share and revenue. That's because in Western Europe, a shareholder is confident that stock certificate, that thing is as good as gold. You own that. The government's not going to take it from you without at least giving you your day in court where you're going to have a real chance to tell the government to go pound sand. Not true in Russia. And that risk depresses stock price. I mean, why would you invest in a Russian company, right? Would you put your life savings in a Russian company right now? No. The government can steal it whenever they want. And the more valuable the company gets, in fact, the more likely the state is to take it. And again, the fact that the U.S. government is looking at this as a great idea is itself insane. But like the U.S. government makes so many other bad economic choices that you almost expect it. But the fact that the Russian state is now doing this same game or ramping up that game, and that it's gotten so bad that the Russian central bank is telling them that they're wrong, they can't do this. This is actually an insane showdown. And it's getting like no play because it requires, of course, a long economic explanation of why. But this is a big deal, a much bigger deal than anyone else is letting on. Anyway, guys, hit subscribe. Thanks to our Colonel tier members at Combat Vet News, guys like Paul Wheeler, Michael Killeen, Jeff Davies, Francis Karius, Thomas Anderson, Eugene Cuesta, and all of our Lieutenant tier members. We could not do it without you guys. Thank you so much. We'll see you in the next one. Cheers.